Cool. Let me just double check something real quick. Yeah, we're good. Okay, so this is time leaf part two. Last week we talked about technically the reading was all about exceptions and using the debugger and the build.gradle file. But last class, I should say, we talked about time leaf, and so we're going to continue this theme. And so today, the specific parts of time leaf we'll be looking at are loops in time leaf, if statements, something called fragments, which I think is pretty cool, and then static resources. And that was that last question that stumped a good amount of us in the Kahoot quiz. So you may remember from Monday that I mentioned that there's a lot of overlap between time leaf and Angular. So in Angular, we had a couple classes on this in Unit 1. This was what a for loop looked like. So we had the ng, short for Angular, for, and then we had this let item, in this case equipment, of array of items, which is in this case cargo hold. So let equipment of cargo hold, and that was sort of our for of loop. And then for each item, we reference the element. And so you could imagine like a for of loop in like Java or JavaScript. This is a similar pattern. Now in time leaf, it's going to be once again a repeating pattern. So here we have instead of the Angular syntax, we're going to have th for time leaf, and then we're going to say each. And then instead of let equipment, we're just going to say equipment. This is the name that we come up with right here. We can call this anything. And then instead of, we're going to have a colon. And then we're going to reference the array list, the thing that we're looping through. And then from there, instead of placing the text from the element in the array, instead of placing that inside of the HTML element, we have a bit of a difference here in that we're saying time leaf. We're going to say we want to take this element, we're going to change its text value, the text that it's displaying, to equal whatever we say. And in this case, we're just grabbing the name from the equipment. Cool. So these look very similar. In time leaf, there's two ways that we can approach making a loop. The first way is basically the last example, and that would be saying repeat this HTML element for every time that there's an item in this array. So as we loop through the array, we're going to be creating a bunch of these paragraph elements. Oops. So that way works, it's valid, but a recommended way is to use something called a block element. And so this is something that time leaf gives us. It's basically you can almost think of it as just syntax. It's not really changing so much of our HTML. And so we can use the block element here. Technically, we can use any element, but this is the design pattern. We can use the block element and have this be a loop, and then everything inside of the element gets repeated. So in both examples, in example 1 and in example 2, we have the same outcome. We have the paragraph tag is duplicated X number of times. The only difference between these two is this one is wrapped in the block element and this one's not. And so the reason why, generally speaking, you choose either. The general reason why number 2 is preferred is because it's syntactically similar to a for each loop. So if you think about like a for loop in Java or JavaScript, we'll have our for loop syntax, and then inside of the loop, that's where we do stuff. And so in this example, we have our for loop syntax, and then inside of the loop is where we copy the elements and do whatever we want. So once again, both are valid. Number 2 is generally preferred. So before we switch context and talk about if statements. Questions? All right.
TH for the block, or is just block? I just saw in the reading that it was TH block instead of block. I must double check.
It's a great question. I would need to test that to verify that. So the question was, should we do th block or just block? Um, yeah, I'm wondering if the difference is whether or not it renders in the HTML, but we'll try to test that because we'll have some time to play around with that. Remind me if we don't get to it. Yeah, great question. Other questions? No? Okay, cool. Moving on. So if statements. So once again, what and this might be tangential, but one of the things I think is really cool about learning programming is how many times that we start repeating concepts without even realizing it sometimes. And so in this example, we can see a angular if statement, and it's very similar to a time leaf if statement. Um, and then they also parallel to a regular Java if statement. And so tangentially, I totally believe that of the people in this room, if we had a project, and let's say it was already developed in like Python, something that we haven't worked with yet, and your assignment was to add a feature, let's say like add another controller to it, I think everyone in this room could do it, and it would be easier than you probably think it would be, using a language that you've never seen before. And the reason why I say that is because we have sort of repeated concepts, and the at this point, a new language is going to look a lot less strange than it would have a couple weeks ago. So here in this example, we have our Angular if statements, G for Angular, and we say if. And so if this Boolean right here is true, we will render the content. If this Boolean is false, we will not render the content. And then the same thing here. It's just slightly different context or syntax, but very similar. So we have the th syntax, colon, if equals, then we have a dollar sign, curly brackets, and then our variable right here. And so an important thing to note about this is in time leaf is determining if the element is going to be rendered, not if the content of the element is going to be rendered. And so, for example, if the user is not logged in, if we were to look at the inspector tab inside of our browser, we would not see an empty paragraph tag where this should be. We won't see that. Instead, we'll just see nothing where this should be. If the user is logged in, then it will render the paragraph tag in content. And so that might not seem super important right now, but if you were designing a page and maybe every element in the page had like a margin around it, so some buffer space, having these empty elements would kind of mess up the layout. And so it's just useful having in the back of our minds that this is determining if the element will be added to the page or not added to the page. Cool. So before we talk about fragments, which I think is pretty cool, questions on if statements or other questions on loops or anything? No? Okay. So fragments for me, also becoming like refamiliarized with time leaf is exciting because, well, I'll tell you why it's exciting after we answer this question. So for anyone in this room, what is a fragment? Someone's got to be able to. Yes. Right. So a fragment, in the context of time leaf, is a reusable piece of time leaf code. And so this, to me, is really an exciting feature of time leaf because with a time leaf up until learning about fragments, all we could do is we could create an entire page, right? And we could do cool stuff like feed data into the page, but what we couldn't do is reuse any pieces of that page. And so that's kind of similar to the limitations of just regular HTML. We could write an HTML page, but if we have to make a similar page, we're copy pasting, we're basically repeating a lot of code, and that's no fun. And so with a fragment, we are able to create little blocks of HTML, of timely flavored HTML, and use it everywhere. So if you imagine a page with a nav bar, you have a website, maybe the website has like 30 different pages. With Timeleaf, we can create the nav bar one time and then just reference it in those 30 different pages. And if we didn't have something like fragments, when we were to add another page to our website, we would have to go back to those 30 pages and update the nav bar to add the extra button for the 31st page we added. And so I think fragments are super useful. So where do fragments live? Generally speaking, in a Java Spring Timeleaf project, they're going to live under resources. They're going to live under templates. And then the recommended name is that we just create a file called fragments and we put all our fragments in that one file. Unless we have too many, maybe we'll break it out. But this is a best practice. This is not a syntactical requirement. But generally speaking, you'll want to put them inside of resources, inside of templates, and in a file called fragments. So a fragment can be something as simple as a single line of code. And so if you imagine the website, maybe a fragment is just showing what day it is, you know, and maybe that's part of the footer. It's just saying what day it is. We could write the code once and then use it everywhere else. Or we could do something a little bit more sophisticated, like we could create the nav bar, the footer. We can also create things that aren't visible on the web page. And so this example right here is a really good example. This is the head element of an HTML file. So this is like all of our metadata. And so here we're able to import things like our CSS files or JavaScript files. We're able to set the title of the web page and kind of just set things up. And so if we're able to do this with a fragment, we can do it once and then reference it. If we don't have fragments, then we have to copy and paste, and that's not fun. So let's say we created these fragments. You'll notice that we know these are a fragment because it uses the th colon fragment syntax. Here is how we reference the fragments throughout our HTML. So we will say something like the name of the element, and then we'll say th replace. We will reference the name of the file. And so let's say we're being creative, and instead of calling it fragments.html, we called it aardvark.html. This value right here would be aardvarks or aardvark. And then we have colon colon, and then we have the name of the specific fragment. And so we'll see here that head and example, these are associated with the names here, th fragment example and th fragment head. And so these placeholders per se, these placeholders will be replaced with the associated fragment. So fragments are cool. Thoughts, questions about fragments? Yes. I'm sorry. What was about the Mm-hmm. Is the space, are these two spaces necessary between the words and the colon? That will be number two thing we get to test. I don't know off the top of my head. Great question, thank you. Other questions about fragments? I've noticed, and this could just be me, but I've noticed whenever I can't answer a question, that's usually the last question that's asked. Feel free to continue asking hard questions. I appreciate it. All right, cool. So we'll get to practice this stuff really soon. We do need to talk about static resources. So this was the question in the group that kind of threw a few of us off. So let's say we want to include things like CSS in our time leaf code. In normal vanilla JavaScript, we could do something like just reference the file path to our CSS, and then it would apply to our code. In Timeleaf, we need some special syntax in order to make this work. And so, generally speaking, we're going to want to put all of our static resources, images, JavaScript files, CSS, we're going to want to put all of our static resources inside of resources / static. So how do we reference these quote unquote static resources? We're going to reference them with the @ symbol. And so you'll notice we have our th for our time leaf syntax, and then we'll have the colon, and then we will have the next thing is dependent on whatever that element property is that we are setting. And so if it is a link tag, we're going to change the href and set it to @styles.css. If it's a script tag, we're going to say th.src for source, and then the same for image, it would be th:\source. And so, yeah, the important thing to really notice here is the @ symbol, because for most other things with Timeleaf, we're not using the @ symbol, we're using the $sign. Another thing that I've seen throw a few people off, including myself, is that for these style sheets, if we don't call it a style sheet with rel equals style sheet, Timeleaf is not going to work with it. So it's important that we include this part here too. Cool, so we're going to see some of this in action here in just a moment. Questions about static resources or the other things that we've covered so far? Yes. Why do I have JavaScript here included in my Java project? Is that the question, or is it more specific? Uh-huh. Right. So it's a great question. The question was like, why on earth are we including JavaScript in a Java project? It's a great question. So in this course, in this LaunchCode course, we're not going to really mix in JavaScript inside our Java project, but we totally could. So if you think back to things like event listeners, so an event listener was something that where we could use JavaScript that would respond if whenever the user did something. If the user moves their mouse, if they click on something, if they just hover over an element, all of these things are triggering events in our browser. And JavaScript is really the right tool to respond to those events. And so we could do things like with our JavaScript, we could say when you click on this button, we're going to send a fetch request to our Java controller, and then that's going to populate the user interface with data. There's a lot of really cool things we could do by adding in JavaScript. We're just not going to see a lot of that during this course. But yeah, it's technically possible because, as has been said before, I'll just kind of reiterate it here. The only scripting language that can run in the browser is JavaScript. And so we're using Java to render our HTML and provide it to the browser to view. But if we want to do anything, if we want to do any programming that runs in real time inside the browser itself, we're going to need to use JavaScript. So it's a great question. But yeah, so there's a lot of possibilities with it. We're just unfortunately not going to see much of that in this course. Just potential, you can see it that way. Cool, great question. Other questions? All right, so let's code. So what I have here is nothing super structured. We're just going to try to build out a lot lot of these ideas we've talked about. So far what I've done is I went to the Spring Initializer, I created a new project similar to how we did Monday, and I included these three dependencies. And I've got it already loaded up. And so all of my dependencies have kind of loaded up and stuff. And so I haven't written any code yet. So here we just have our main class that's going to run the application. And so let's go ahead and look back at the slide deck and see what we're trying to build here. So we're trying to create a basic controller that returns template. Okay. So I don't have a place to put my controllers yet, so I'm going to create a new package called controllers. And then inside of controllers, I'm going to put a class called, well, it depends on what this application is. We've kind of, the most consistent theme we've had was doggos, so we'll just do doggo. Okay, and so this is going to be a controller, so we'll say add controller. Then we'll do alt enter to import it. Well, it has to be uppercase. There we go. For that I did tab. And so now we want a method to handle all the HTTP traffic that just goes to our any URL. In this case, we're just going to do the home path. So we'll say get mapping. We'll say public return string, and then we'll call this home. Then for now, we'll return something that says home. And now we're going to run this project and see it not work, but at least we'll see it hopefully not crash. That's the goal. So we'll go to localhost 8080. Cool. So we get a white label error page. Essentially, we don't have anything mapped to that. We could sort of prove that it's working by adding a request mapping or request body, I believe it is. And so this is just going to return the home string. Did I use the wrong one? Response body, thank you. Thank you. All right, we'll rerun this. Refresh the page. Then once it loads, it should just say home. So it just says home. And so at this point, we may have a bit of an idea of how to do this, but I'm going to turn this into a question. How can I, instead of just returning the text home, how can I return a time leaf template called home? Any takers? Yes. Add one to the resources folder. Okay. Under resources, I'm assuming templates. Add a new, oops, cancel. Add a new HTML file. This is my own preset called timeleaf, and we'll call it home. So now we're going to refresh the page, and it should say test because I just created a timeleaf flavored HTML file. Let's refresh, and now we can prove that we're referencing our timeleaf file. Cool. So it's not super pretty, but we kind of checked off the first item in our goals. The next thing we want to do is we want to feed the timeleaf file data. And so the first thing we're going to do is provide it, we'll do an array list because I think that makes more sense. So in our doggo class, we kind of need an array list to work with. And so this is going to kind of get into what we'll be learning about next week, but we don't have a place for our data to live. So for now, we're just going to do a temporary fix Um, and we're going to create a static, and then we will call this array list. And the array list will be filled with strings. This should be easy enough to work with. We'll call it doggos equals new array list. Plural, thank you. Appreciate the assist. All right, there we go. So now we have an empty array list, and I'm going to once again, this is sort of a temporary workaround because we don't have a good place to put our data. But I'm going to add a few things to the array list. So I'll say doggos dot let's see, is it put or is it add? Maybe I think it doesn't like it where I'm putting it. Let's just go ahead and do it in get mapping. Doggos dot add, say bonsai. Then this one will be Sherlock. And then we'll do a third one. I've run out of dog names. I need another dog name. Gordon. Cool. Is Owen good? Is that the right spelling for Gordon? Cool. Sweet. All right. So we've basically we've added items to our array list, and now we're going to we need to add it to our time leaf template. How do I do that? How do I pass data into a time leaf template? Any takers on this one? Model. I need to reference the model. So here I'll say model tab, which automatically imports it. I can verify that it imported correctly. And then I will call this, I can call this anything. So I'm going to call this, just to prove that, I'm going to call this doggo model. And I'll say doggo model dot add attribute. And we're going to call this doggos, plural. And we're going to add doggos. Cool, so now we can refresh this page. And we will prove that it at least isn't crashing. But we don't have any doggos on our page yet, so we're going to need to do something else. So the first thing that we did successfully is that we've passed in a bunch of data. We passed in an array list of doggo names into our template, but the template isn't doing anything with it yet. So now we're going to need to create a loop, which is super relevant. And this also brings up the thing we wanted to test. So it's the difference between doing block versus th block. We'll go ahead and see how those two things work. So we'll start with saying th for, and then we'll say doggo of, then we need our $sign, our curly brackets. Let me see if we can make this a little bit more visible. Doggo of doggos. And then in here, we can do something like th name equals, and then we'll just say doggo. In theory, this should work, and this will loop through the doggos, and then we will, yeah, we'll see something or not. Let's refresh this, and I have an error. Let's see here. I messed something up. What was it? Could not parse expression. Is it supposed to be each? It's a great question. Or a great statement, I should say. Probably the answer. Let's refresh this. Let's refresh this again. Okay, so I've got something close. Let me see here. for each doggo. Looks like we're missing something. So for like great suggestions. Any suggestions? Yes. Yes, it should. Nice. Let's refresh. Let's refresh again. It's still loading, I guess. Yay, we have our list of doggo names. Great. Thank you, thank you. All right, cool. We got Bonsai, Sherlock, and Gordon. That's cool. Let's pull up our code. So one question that was brought up in lecture is like, what exactly is this block thing? Can we say th block or not? And so the question I have about this is this for sure rendered in the HTML behind the scenes? So we're going to go ahead and look in the inspector tab, and we can see that block shows up. Okay, it shows up for every element, and so that's kind of how our loops are working. It's basically saying repeat this block of HTML for every item. So let's try something else. We'll say th block. We'll rerun it. We're going to verify if it works and then if it works differently. Cool. So it works differently and it works better. So in this case, we have our three elements, but because we use the proper syntax of saying th colon block, it's just rendering what was inside of the block element, not the entire element itself. Uh, so that would be the correct way, the best way to do it. Yeah, excellent. So questions on that? Questions on this loop here before we start doing other things? Yes.
Well, I was wondering because with HTML5, you just kind of come up with your own custom tags. Do you think that's how that was working in
Probably. Yeah, it was probably HTML is like, I don't care what you call it, I'm just gonna do something with it. Let's prove that question. The question was maybe HTML5 doesn't care what we called it, and that's why it worked before. So we're going to call aardvark, which I have a high degree of confidence that is not an HTML element. If I was, I would know about it. And here we can see we just created a bunch of aardvark HTML elements, which don't exist and we probably shouldn't use. So yeah, that was a great call out. And so if we call these just block, it's as if we're inventing that element, like you pointed out. If we call it th colon block, now we're referencing the special time leaf syntax. And now it is not adding the block to HTML. It's just adding the contents of the block. Very good. Cool. Other questions, comments? Yes. So the block, not specific to time leaf. You said when you add th special time leaf syntax, block was added in HTML. I believe we can make up our own HTML tags, like was pointed out, but I'm pretty sure it is the combination of th and block that is special. And we can try something like th aardvark, and if my inclination is correct, this will not work the same way. So let's refresh. Yeah, so this just created a bunch of th aardvark elements, whatever we just named it, and that's kind of messy and not what we want. And so, yeah, the most correct way to do this is going to be the combination of th colon block, and then that makes it so that the only thing that gets rendered is the contents. Yeah, cool. Yeah, that's cool. I'm glad we kind of went a couple different directions on that. Awesome. Other questions, comments? No? All right. So the next thing we want to do is add an if statement, I believe. Add items manually. We already did it manually. Don't worry about using a form. We've seen plenty of that in the reading. Loop through the items. We've done that. So we're going to create an if statement, and then we're going to experiment with fragments. Okay, so an if statement. We are going to just add a Boolean to the time leaf template just to play around with and to experiment with. So we'll say, oops, doggo model dot add attribute. We're going to name it. We'll say is true, comma, and we're going to pass it. We're just going to hard code a true Boolean. And so to be very clear about what we're doing right here is we're naming what this this value is that we're passing into the template, and then we are passing in the value itself. And so when we jump over to the template, we need to reference it by the name we gave it. So we're going to need to reference it by the word is true, and then is true will of course be associated with the true Boolean because that's the value we passed in. So real quick, we'll do a p paragraph thing. And we'll say, can you see me? And so here, we'll do th if equals, and then we'll use our $, curly brackets. Notice that it's also in quotes, and then we'll say is true. Can you see me? Let's go ahead and rerun this code. And we can see, in fact, we can see the p paragraph thing. And the reason why is because this element rendered because the value is true. If we were to change it to false, and we were to rerun this, it's going to disappear on us once it catches up. Or did it? We got some weird stuff happening up here. Let's see here. Oh, I accidentally pressed a button. All right, let's try this again. Let's refresh, and that should all be cleared away. We're going to try something else here. We're going to look at artifacts, but there was another question during lecture that we were going to try out once we could reach this portion. I forgot what it was. So we tried out the whole th block thing. Yes. Right. Okay, and that will come up with, yeah, we'll try that with artifacts here in just a bit. Perfect. So before we transition into experimenting with artifacts, any questions or comments on how this whole if statement works? Yes. Mm-hmm. Is it still called template literal? Yes. I don't know. I have to Google that. I'm not sure what they call it. They probably not. Sorry. Thanks for the question, though. Let's go ahead and right before we try artifacts, I also want to demonstrate something. I'm going to abstract this if statement out and put it in a block. So we're going to go ahead and run this, and still nothing should show up. And we'll verify it looking at our HTML to the right side. We had something show up. Let's see here. That subverted my expectation. Th block if is true, pass in, can you see me? Ah, thank you. Sweet. Really appreciate all of the assists. Refresh, and you should see it disappear. Yeah, now it's gone. Cool. And if we were to change this back to true, we should see the p paragraph thing, but not the block statement. Let's prove that that's true. Refresh. Right, so we can see p tag for paragraph, but we don't see the block statement. And that's because it's that special time leaf block that is just sort of a placeholder for like for loops and if statements and things like that. Question for the group: how would I do like an else statement with time leaf? THLS? Unless? That's a great suggestion. Let's try that. THLs, I'm assuming I don't need this. Unless. Oh, I know what you're saying. Yeah. We will need this. Unless. Let's run this again. I'm going to change this to up here to say, can you see me? And this will be, yes, you can. And then this will be, no, you can't. And then me is going to be a dog, and so I need to get a dog emoji. So go to semicolon, then we'll go to dog. How I do things is not necessarily, doesn't always make sense. Yes, you can, doggo. There we go. All right, let's refresh this. Can you see me? Yes, you can, because the Boolean is true. And then, of course, if it was false, it would say, no, you can't. And since that's what we're testing, I think we should test that real quick. False, rerun the application. Refresh. It says, no, you can't. So cool. So that would be how we would do an else statement. I'll say, like, personally for myself, I'm not a huge fan of the unless syntax. Personally, if I were to write this, I would probably just say if and then is not true. And this would work the same way. That would just really, as a developer, that'd be your personal preference as far as which one you choose. But they're going to work the same way. Unless isn't the same thing necessarily as else. It's basically the same thing as like if it's not true, right? Cool. So let's go ahead and add some CSS real quick, and then we'll demonstrate how to turn that into an artifact. So for starters, we'll say new. All right, so this question came up last week. I'm going to see if we still remember this. How can I create a CSS file? What was that? Just make a file, call it whatever, and then .css. Yeah, that worked. Cool, thanks. All right. I'm just going to quickly add some styles here. Background color. Call this like a dark gray. Then we'll say color, make this white. And then we'll say font. It's actually, I know this is not the important part of it, but we'll use a Google font. So this is a super easy thing you can do. If you want to style your page, you can go to Google Fonts. There's other resources like this. But we will find a font that looks interesting, this one. And then I can say, I don't want to download it. I want to select it. And then I can see my selected fonts. I have one in here from before. I'm going to get rid of that because that's not part of what we're trying to do. I can copy this import statement, put it at the top of my CSS. It's worth noting that this is a totally normal CSS file. We can do anything we want to in here that would apply to CSS. And then I'm going to copy the CSS rule. All right, so now we have our HTML style. And so now in home, we need to reference it. So I believe it's a link. Let's use timeleaf to reference it. And then it's an href equals, and then we have to use the @ sign, not the $sign. And then we'll say /, styles.css. We have to include the rel style sheet, and I think it's self-closing. Let's refresh our application and see if our CSS took hold. It took hold. I don't see the font changes. Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's where the error was. Y'all are on it today. Let's refresh. Got a cool font. Cool. This is very subjective here. Cool. But anyways, we just proved that we can include CSS. But if I want to make a big website, I want to make multiple pages, it doesn't, I don't feel like I have to copy and paste all of this up here, if I don't want to. So I'm going to create a new timely file. I'm going to call this artifacts. Is this the same as what? I missed, yeah, this is fragments. I call them artifacts. Thank you. Refactor, rename. Fragments, and then take this, replace this, and then let's see. Syntax escapes me. We need to reference it by calling it th fragment, and then we can give it a name. So in our head, we'll say th fragments. Head. Then up here in our home page, we can erase all of this. We don't have to, but we can. And then we need our other side to catch the changes, which is th replace. Th replace the name of the file and then the name of the specific fragment. So let's refresh this. It should look the same unless I have an error. It looks the same, so we're pretty good. One thing we need to test out is if it cares about these spaces. Let's refresh. Nah, it doesn't care about the spaces. Honestly, that's really the best way in most cases to figure something out when you're programming, as opposed to like making an assumption or even sometimes Googling it. Just trying it and seeing if it works will teach a lot. And then the last thing I wanted to demonstrate is I'm just going to call this Kiwi. I'm going to refresh this, refactor this, and call this Kiwi. Reload. And it still works. And so that was just to demonstrate that the name of our fragment file is technically up to us. It's just best practice to call fragments. And so yeah, cool. That really brings us up right next to the end of lecture. This is our last chance for questions and stuff before we break for studio. Yes? It's a great thing to call out. So thank you for that. So essentially, in here, the syntax for fragments is changing, what you're saying. We should not see that during this class. And the reason why we shouldn't see that is because we're using a very specific version of Java. Maybe, I mean, we can verify that. The way we could verify that would be by looking at our build.gradle. And I was hoping that this would tell me which version. We could get dig a bit deeper to figure out exactly what version of Timeleaf we have. My gut feeling is that because we're locked down on an older version of Java, we're not going to see it. But if we do, we'll pivot. Yeah, thanks for calling that out. I was not aware of it. Yeah, syntax and this stuff changes, especially when things jump a major version. Cool. Other questions, comments before we break? No. Great. Well, thank you for joining me for lecture. I'll see you back here at 8. And good luck with Studio. It should be fun.